Hi everyone. On Tuesday, September 3rd, I did my initial video on the Rancho Palos Verdes landslide. That video got a great reception, so I thought I would do another update. I'm recording this on Saturday, September 7th. Now on the 3rd, the governor of California declared a state of emergency due to the loss of power and, for many people, gas in the Rancho Palos Verdes area. These utilities were cut off as a precaution so that wildfires couldn't be sparked. As a reminder, this is the area of Southern California that we're talking about. We're talking about the Palos Verdes Peninsula. Now, the Los Angeles County Supervisor, Jessica Hahn, has stated publicly that she believes it's going to take up to $1 billion to finally stabilize this landslide area. That's a lot of money. So the most recent update from the city on September 6th is the city continues to monitor the status of utility shutoffs in the landslide area and work closely with utilities, emergency management personnel, and our public safety partners responding to the emergency. So right now they have a voluntary evacuation order. It's not mandatory. This is the area we're talking about, this aerial view. So in this video, I'm going to address many of your comments to my previous video. Some of you said, these are a bunch of rich people. Who cares? Let them deal with it. Other people had specific solutions as to how to go forward. And also many people thought this is a lost cause. So I'm going to address all of these aspects and provide more technical underpinnings for what's going on out there. Now I want to bring a little more personal perspective to this situation. Not me personally, but an individual who lived in that area for many decades, he and his family, reached out to me and gave me a lot of information. So, Mr. Ruth, I really appreciate you sending this information to me. This is a picture of him and his family. And they used to live in this area for many, many years. And it certainly is a beautiful area. This is the church that's currently being taken down because it's being threatened by the landslide. Just absolutely beautiful homes with fantastic views. There's Catalina Island off in the distance. A lot of wildlife there. There's a flying peacock. So I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding about when people moved in. This area of Los Angeles County was unincorporated up until the time of 1973. And before being incorporated as a city, there were already many, many homes there. And then after 1973 and 1978, the city implemented a moratorium on any new construction in that landslide area. And in a bit, I'll go over what happened with that moratorium in light of subsequent lawsuits. Now let's get a little bit better understanding of the geology here. And this is a document that's posted on one of the city website references for this landslide. And I'll put a number of these links in the description to this video. Landslides have occurred throughout the peninsula, but none are more prominent than those of the approximately 900-acre ancient Portuguese Bend landslide complex and surrounding areas. In general, these landslides are the result of inclined bedding to the south that becomes unsupported due to the erosion from beach waves and intrusion from water runoff. As landslides move downslope into the beach zone due to loss of support from erosion, the material upslope from these areas loses support and becomes susceptible to landsliding as well. So this is exactly what's going on right now. According to the 2011 geotechnical study, the initial landsliding that occupies the bulk of the area observed today occurred approximately 120,000 years ago, with possibly initial movements as early as 500,000 years ago. Landslides in the South Shore occurred approximately 16,200 years ago. And historical landsliding of the Portuguese Bend landslide and Abalone Cove landslide indicates that mass movements will still occur in the area today. Thus, it is reasonable to conclude that landsliding occurs nearly continuously, at least in geologic terms, throughout the ancient Portuguese Bend landslide complex, that landsliding will continue into the future. Well, that's accurate. Here's a photo from 1931, aerial photo, and it shows the outline of these various slides. You can see how the ground is really mounded, individual mounds. That's called hummocky terrain, and it's a sure indication of previous landslide activity. There's been numerous geologic studies done. This is one from 1946. Here's a report on slide movement in Portuguese Bend from 1957. I'll just read this. Immediate cause of slide. In the light of the results of the research measurements and tests which have been conducted on the earth movement at Portuguese Bend, and which have been summarized in the preceding portion of this report, it appears evident that the area now sliding had a very small factor of safety in 1955, and that the immediate cause of the movement in 1956 and 1957 was the placement of the Crenshaw Fill. So this was LA County road construction that was going on. Now, here's a letter that Mr. Ruth provided to me. It was prepared by Dr. Perry Ellig. He was a very well-known geologist with extensive experience in this area. And he basically concluded that this area would remain stable as long as remediation measures were successfully implemented and that there wasn't an inundation of precipitation in some future time frame well above what would be expected in a typical year. Dr. Ellig passed in 1999, but this is from the report that he prepared. You can see the outline of this moratorium area, and the house that he was looking at for this study was just outside of that area. So again, you have the delineation of these various slide areas. You have the Rancho Palos Verdes Redevelopment Agency, and then you have the boundary of the landslide moratorium, where they didn't want to allow any additional residential development. But shortly after 1978, there was this legal entity created, which is the Abalone Cove Landslide Abatement District. So essentially, the state and city pulled together financial resources to not only monitor and study what was going on with these landslides, but also to implement remediation measures. So they've no doubt spent tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars over the decades trying to stabilize this slope. And to put this in perspective, up until recently, the movement for the last almost 50 years has been relatively gradual, on the order of less than a foot a year. And now the movement's closer to 50 feet a year. So something drastically has changed with the condition of this landslide, and I'll go over what that is here in a moment. So let's talk about this. The Abalone Cove Landslide Abatement District is a geologic hazard abatement district created by the city of Rancho Palos Verdes and residences of the Abalone Cove community under special legislation passed by the California legislature in 1980 for the purposes of prevention, mitigation, abatement, or control of the Abalone Cove landslide. It was the first geohazard abatement district created in the state. District is governed by 5 elected directors, which serve for a period of 4 years. Under the California Improvement Act of 1911, the district may assess properties benefiting from the mitigation or abatement efforts for the cost of the improvements. This abatement district is broadly responsible for abatement efforts to prevent movement of the Abalone Cove land movement. To do this, the district operates and maintains dewatering wells and associated discharge lines, easements to assure access to the dewatering facilities, monitors groundwater elevations throughout the district, reviews measurements of the global positioning system for evidence of slide movement, and works with the city of Rancho Palos Verdes to maintain certain storm culverts and other improvements related to landslide abatement. So this is a quasi-governmental agency, if not an outright government agency, actively attempting to manage this landslide movement. So we've just covered that, dewatering wells and monitoring. Now let's look at these various boundaries. The purple is the Abalone Cove Landslide Abatement District. The red is the landslide moratorium area. There's another moratorium area in blue to the lower right. The orange there is Klondike Canyon landslide. The yellow is the Abalone Cove landslide. The pink is the Flying Triangle landslide, if you can make that out, the upper right. And the lime green is the Portuguese Bend landslide. And these dots, blue, yellow, and red, are various dewatering wells. As I mentioned, up until the last couple of years, movement had been relatively low after the time of 1984. So you can see here the city began putting its stabilization plan into effect in 1984. At that time, the landslide was moving in excess of 40 feet per year. Today, only 5 years after the plan first began, consisting of the monitoring wells, improvements with surface drainage, and earth redistribution, which changes the mass from the landslide from driving to resisting forces. So you move material from the upper part of the slope and put it in the lower portion of the slope to act as a buttress against the slide. And after those efforts, this landslide is moving less than 1 foot per year. And that was the case up until 2022, I believe. Now, getting back to the question of why were people allowed to build houses in this area? So in 2002, a group of property owners who had vacant lots and they were planning to build houses on them filed a lawsuit because they weren't allowed to build because of this moratorium going back to 1978. Well, these plaintiffs prevailed. And that's because the judge determined that the city didn't have enough compelling evidence that it was a bad idea to let people continue to build houses there. And from a property rights viewpoint, you essentially have the government confiscating property if you're not able to sell it, if you're not able to build on it. So in the view of this judge, the government had to have a more compelling reason to not allow that to happen. And after these remediation efforts in the 1980s, I think it made it harder for the city to make that case. You know, if movement was less than a foot a year, people could implement stabilization measures. They were in some cases, they would separate the house from the foundation and then put steel beams underneath the house and then support those by jacks to deeper foundation elements, and they could periodically re-level the house. So a lot of money was spent working with this lower rate of movement, again, up until 2 years ago, and now movement in portions of this landslide are approaching 50 feet a year. So in order to comply with this ruling, the city commissioned a study to determine, okay, we're going to have to grant permits to these people, but there's going to be strict criteria for them to essentially get an exemption to this moratorium. So the moratorium wasn't lifted, but they came up with rules for people to get an exemption or exception and then be able to subsequently build in those areas. So at that time, they're looking at the potential of 47 properties for single-story ranch-style residences with either attached or detached 3-car garages with a minimum living area of 1,500 square feet and maximum living area of 4,000 square feet, or 15% of gross lot area, whichever is less. And there was restrictions on the amount of cut and fill, a restriction on maximum building height, and so on. So as part of this exception permit, the applicant shall submit to the director any geological or geotechnical studies reasonably required by the city to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the city geotechnical staff that the proposed project will not aggravate the existing situation. So this is this area in red that was going to be eligible for potential exemptions to the building moratorium. And this is what the lots look like, the parcels for that property. At that time, they were undeveloped. And here's an aerial view. You can see now there's a number of homes there. Now, fortunately for those people, they're still in the more stable area of the slide, which is in green. But the red area that's still moving at a very high rate, and that's because the ancient landslide has been reactivated. This is an overall view of the slide areas. Now, the reason why this is sliding is you have weak layers of bentonite clay in the subsurface. And these bentonite clays, in this case, formed due to volcanic ash that formed a rock called a tuff, and weathering produces a very weak clay, and it becomes even weaker with wetting, but the inherent shear strength has a peak value immediately after movement or shearing starts, and then that peak value drops to a residual value, which is much lower. And those residual strengths are activated at large displacements, which we have now. So we've got several problems here. We've got a pile up of material that's sliding along this plane along the shoreline. The ocean erodes the toe. It removes resisting forces along that slide surface. We have lower residual shear strengths. And we have, at this time, high pore water pressures. So high groundwater elevations in the slide mass. And higher groundwater elevations causes a lower shear strength to occur in these materials because of an increase in effective pore water pressures or effective stress. So in essence, you have water pressure essentially keeping some of the soil particles apart, thereby reducing the strength of that material that would otherwise occur. Just a close-up view here. was trying to read the elevations. This is a screenshot off a presentation, but it looks like overall at the top of the cross section here, it's elevation 700 and some feet. And obviously we go down to 0 at sea level. And that slide area is about a mile wide and a mile long. And apparently the discovery of this deeper ancient slide is new. It's at a depth of 330 feet. The previous slide area was identified at a depth of 165 feet. So this is quite alarming. This is a new development in modern times and historical times of movement occurring at this lower shear surface. So let's review some additional summaries from this geologic study. This ancient Portuguese bend landslide moved as a translational type landslide along pre-existing weak layers composed of bentonite clay that is inclined towards the ocean. Some geologic reviewers interpret the data as indicating that this landslide initially moved as a single sheet, in part because of the lateral continuity of the entire landslide complex, and then broke into smaller landslides shortly thereafter. Others hypothesize that the landsliding occurred in several relatively smaller stages that then migrated upslope as a series of landslides as successive parcels of land became unsupported from the downslope failures. And you can see this is happening right now. You have the formation of a new beach, and material that's essentially the toe of the slide is pushing out underneath the water several hundred feet offshore. And they're going to do an updated bathymetric survey to figure out exactly how far that material goes and what its elevation is. I wanted to see what the ground elevations look like through this area. Red is roughly around 300 meters, so over 1,000 foot elevation, and you go down to 0, obviously for sea level. So that matches the cross section that in this immediate area we have a change in elevation of around 600 feet. Now some people have commented, people knew this was a landslide area. Why would they move there? Fact is, if you look at a map, almost half of California is in a landslide hazard area. Here's a view of the peninsula, and you can see the dark red area, which is the area of the Portuguese Bend landslide. Here's what it looks like statewide. Pretty much high hazard, particularly along the coast relative to landslides, except for the Central Valley. But even then, you have this circular area, which is Sutter Buttes. It's an old volcano. So again, in keeping with what we talked about earlier, the weathered volcanic ash turns to bentonite clay and is very weak. As I mentioned in the previous video, the city's putting in these horizontal drains, these hydroggers. There were 2 distinct locations for these hydroggers, but now they're finding that these aren't likely to be deep enough, or they won't be deep enough at the current plan of going roughly below that 165-foot slide level. Now they've got this much deeper slide to contend with, and they're planning to deal with that deeper slide area with dewatering wells. They're planning additional borings throughout this area for that purpose. While compiling my research for this video, I came across this New Zealand Geotechnical Society document on slope stability geotechnical guidance. And it's an amazing document. New Zealand and California have a lot in common. They have earthquakes, they have relatively young geology, poorly consolidated soil and rock deposits. It's just an area that has tremendous problems with landslides in both locations. But what's interesting to me is in a section of this report, they present risk analysis. If you look at this Venn diagram, the intersection of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability equates to risk. And then you have a risk matrix, which is qualitative or semi-quantitative assessment of risks. And again, it's showing that you have higher risk the more likely something is, as well as when the consequences are greater. So you can have an event that's less likely to occur, but because the consequences are so great, it could be a high hazard. And then in this document, they present numerical methods for doing more of a quantitative risk assessment analysis. But I thought this was an interesting paragraph, 2.4, risk acceptability. For qualitative and semi-quantitative risk assessments, the level of risk that is acceptable varies depending on the tolerance of the stakeholders. However, in most frameworks, moderate or medium risks are typically considered as broadly tolerable, often with the requirement for risk maintenance measures to be implemented. And I think that describes exactly what's been going on in this area since 1984, since they've implemented these remediation measures. The movement's been more or less manageable and predictable up until the last couple of years. and quantitative assessments of lives risk, societal acceptance criteria need to be considered. Society has a lower tolerance for hazard events that result in multiple fatalities. Risk-based performance criteria are discussed later. So the geologists involved with this current situation and studying this landslide and involved with the remediation efforts have said at this point they don't view the risk of a catastrophic failure as very high. I mean, that'd be a failure that involves a large number of homes over a very short period of time where people wouldn't be able to evacuate in time. So you don't want people covered up by landslide debris in the middle of the night, for example. And they say that that risk is extremely low. But again, they will continue to reassess that. So bottom line, they need to do a lot more studying about what's going on here. I think there needs to be a risk assessment. I think there needs to be a cost-benefit analysis performed. You know, you're talking hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion, according to the LA County Supervisor, that it's going to take to get this stabilized. I don't know that much thought has been given up until now about how to stabilize that deeper slide. That's a much different animal. And it's quite possible that depending on how long these outages occur, if people aren't able to get back into their homes, and they're not able to come up with what they call off-grid solutions. I know the mayor was talking to Elon Musk for solar panel and battery storage options for this area. But some people think that the city may take this opportunity to essentially condemn a bunch of properties, probably offer some amount of compensation through eminent domain, and turn that area into a nature preserve. But in the meantime, there's things that can be done, and this is a great comment. Army Corps of Engineers needs to get out there to Portuguese Bend now and fill the fissures, scarps, and line the canyons, that is the creek, Altamira Creek, so more water does not get into the groundwater. Altamira Creek actually starts as an above-ground creek, and at one point down near the bottom of Rattlesnake Trail, a little further than maybe Kelvin's Trail, it goes into a cave and the water goes underground. City should have remedied this long ago. So let's look at what she's talking about here. The blue line is this Altamira Creek. You can make out the vegetation along the creek. And now I'm going to zoom in. And you see it's just an exposed rock channel. So perhaps they could excavate that channel and line it with a impermeable membrane, high-density polyethylene sheets or something of that nature to reduce the amount of infiltration. As I mentioned, this is the current advisory recommending people to evacuate the area. It's not mandatory. We'll see how long this continues. So this is a very complex issue. A number of you people basically said, hey, these are rich people, let them fend for themselves. I don't think it's that simple. Also, with the city's past involvement and that of the state, it's a feedback loop kind of thing where one actions precipitate a reaction, and it's all intertwined. So I don't think government entities should be looking at the financial status of people to determine whether they're going to give them help or not. Some people think that the city has a lot of liability because they put together the rules for development in this area, at least post-1973. Other people will point out that the city's hand was forced through these lawsuits. So if you could go back in time, and at the time of that lawsuit, the city wasn't able to make a compelling case for why development shouldn't occur in this area. And so I'd be curious if that's the case now. So at this point, I think they need to go with the low-hanging fruit, fill in the surface cracks, divert surface water, and then study the heck out of this area. And I think they probably should impanel an independent group of engineering geologists and geotechnical engineers who haven't previously been involved with this project, just to have an unbiased view. And I say that advisedly. I mean, if you've been involved with studying this and trying to come up with fixes, you're in it. You're committed to try and keep doing that. And if you're in that position, it's very hard to step back and say, hey, wait a minute, does what we're doing here even make any sense in terms of the big picture? So I think that could be more readily handled by an independent review board. That's just my thoughts on that. So I'll continue to update this story as we go along here. Please reach out to me, offer your comments down below. I really appreciate the engagement. Please consider becoming a channel member. I've spent a lot of time on this research and I enjoy it, but The channel members and super thanks folks really do help me support this channel, and I appreciate that. I'm going to roll their credits here at the end. So I've got a couple of digital downloads in the description you might want to check out. As I mentioned, I have links to these various references that I mentioned in this video in the description. So check that out. Please stay tuned for future videos. Thanks very much, everyone.